Polanyi at Concordia University in Montreal. I'm delighted to welcome you all here this morning. Perhaps some of you attended a session just before the American elections, where our speakers, who will be introduced by Danielle and Salée in a moment, our speakers discussed, debated, exchanged with the audience about the forthcoming election. Biden was elected. We are now 2 years plus into his administration. The midterm elections took place. Many of you probably listened to that extraordinary State of the Union speech that had everybody jumping off their chairs a couple of weeks ago by Biden. The challenges in the U.S. remain as they were, and in many cases have actually escalated, increased, accelerated. And so we thought we would do a take two with our U.S. panel. And I will introduce Danielle Salée, my colleague at Concordia University, who is currently chair of the political science department at the university and also professor at the School of Community and Public Affairs, and a very active member and a right-hand person at the Karl Polanyi Institute. So Danielle, over to you, and you can introduce our speakers. Just one more second, housekeeping. Please, everyone online, keep your mutes on during the discussion. And because we're a small-ish group, we decided that we would have questions and comments live rather than the chat. If a lot of people join along the way, we may combine chats and live conversation. We have an hour and a half for our conversation. Danielle, good morning, and over to you.
Good morning. Good morning to you all. Thank you very much, Margie. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyan-Gehaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters surrounding Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, which is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Thank you all for being here. And thank you certainly to our panelists, Fred Block, Robert Kuttner, and Margaret Summers. I'm very delighted to have you again to discuss U.S. politics and certainly the past 2 years. Our panelists are well known to, I guess, most of you, but I will still introduce them very briefly. Fred Block is a research professor of sociology at the University of California, Davis. He has written on a broad range of topics in political economy and economic sociology, written and edited many books. You are probably more familiar with one of his latest books, The Power of Market Fundamentalism, Karl Polanyi's Critique, which he co-wrote with Margaret Summers. And he's basically edited recently a book that was with Robert Hockett called Democratizing Finance. Fred is also the founder and president of the Center for Engaged Scholarship, which supports dissertation students at U.S. universities whose work promises to contribute to struggles for social and environmental justice. And of course, Professor Block is a great friend of the Polanyi Institute and is a member of its executive committee. Next, we have Robert Kuttner, who's a co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect magazine, and Meyer and Haida Kirstein professor at Brandeis University's Heller School. He was a longtime columnist for Business Week, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post Syndicate. He was a founder of the Economic Policy Institute and serves on its board and executive committee. Professor Kuttner is the author of 13 books, the most recent of which was published less than a year ago, Going Big, FDR's Legacy, Biden's New Deal, and the Struggle to Save Democracy. Professor Kuttner is also the winner of several awards, including the Paul Hoffman Award of the United Nations for his lifetime work on economic efficiency and social justice. He also serves on the advisory council of the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Margaret Summers, who is a professor emerita of sociology and history at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She's a social theorist specializing in political economy, socioeconomic citizenship rights, and the work of Karl Polanyi. She has written several books as well, one of which, of course, the one I just quoted with Fred Block, The Power of Market Fundamentalism. But she's also known for an award-winning book, Genealogies of Citizenship, Market Statelessness, and the Right to Have Rights. And she's currently working on a book in progress, Free Market Utopianism, De-Democratization, and the Alchemy of Redistributive Political Economy, that's a mouthful, which focuses on the role of the state and the fiction of the free market in driving the twin perils of increasing inequality and decreasing democratic rule. She's also a member of our advisory council. I will start. I guess basically what I had in mind was a conversation, certainly for us on this side of the border, Canadians, we sometimes, certainly I can speak for myself, don't know all that much about American politics, looks at it from outside. And I would like to start this conversation, because this is basically what we'll be having a conversation, with consideration on the Biden presidency so far. In the State of the Union address, which was over a month ago, President Biden was quite assertive, and even, I would say, perhaps even feisty. His critics on the Republican side probably would not agree or did not like what he said, but the reviews of his speech were generally positive. I would like to know, my panelists, what you thought of President Biden's performance, and was he gearing up for the next presidential electoral campaign? I will start with you, Robert.
Well, I thought it was terrific. And a little bit of context here. I mean, Biden was a kind of accidental great progressive president. Nobody expected him, least of all with his rather thin working majority, to try to emulate Franklin Roosevelt. But by the force of circumstances, I think he tried to do that and was more successful than a lot of people thought he was going to be, and that State of the Union address showed him at his best. The problem, because of his age, because of a lot of people just experience him as too old, the success of the State of the Union address had a fairly short half-life. He improved his approval ratings by 2 or 3 points. Now the best it's been in about a year. He's still underwater, and there's this real paradox that people give him credit for being normal while the Republicans are crazy, and give him credit for a lot of accomplishments, but they don't think he ought to run for re-election. And that makes the future of America, the United States of America, as a democracy very, very iffy.
Professor Summers, your take on that?
I like that line. They perceive him as being normal. I agree with Bob that the performance was masterful, but at the same time, he can't get away from the sort of doddering aspect. But I want to focus more on the content, on what worried me about it. On the one hand, it was wonderful that he spent so much time on what we basically recognize as economic populism. And it's about time that a Democrat did that. And I think it was about 70 minutes that he spent doing that. And then he left about 120 seconds. That's what I found when I asked Dr. Google, and I learned that it was about 120 seconds that he spent talking about democracy. And the way he talked about democracy is what worried me. He talked about it in a typical Joe Biden way, which is we're all friends and we all know that we all believe in democracy, and it's not a partisan issue, and it's all about unity. And by making that the kind of aspirational definition of how we achieve a greater degree of democracy, and by speaking entirely in the passive voice, he named no enemies of democracy, like he has in some of his less visible speeches, nothing about MAGA. It was just democracy is under threat, yes, okay, by some anonymous source. And focusing on unity, what he does is he sets up this false ideal that the way we achieve democracy is only by achieving unity. And it's a complete erasure of the fact that that anti-democracy has been the hallmark of the Republican Party now for 40, 50 years, and certainly since the Civil Rights Movement. And so if the norm is unity, then people somehow assume that we shouldn't be actively fighting on one side, that it is a partisan issue, democracy at this point. It is a partisan issue. It's a Democratic Party issue. And when Biden says, as he did in that speech, and he says it every time he opens his mouth, he says, and this is a direct quote, "I've never been more optimistic in my life about the state of America and the future of America," it comes across as totally out of touch. Certainly as a woman, and most women, I feel, the idea that he would say post-Roe, when women are literally, lives are at threat all over this country, that he's never been more optimistic with the court that we have in the state of democracy. So this is what worries me, is that it's all framed in that Biden-esque fantasy world.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we'll come back on certainly on that, and of course the role of the Republicans and all this. Fred Block.
Yeah, I guess I would make 2 points. I mean, the first is that in terms of the transformation of Joe Biden from corporate Democrat to FDR wannabe, we owe an enormous debt to the January 6th insurrectionists. And in other words, they created for the Democratic Party a near-death experience. The Democratic Party, throughout our lifetime has been characterized by centrism, caution, a refusal to take on major structural issues. And the near-death experience of seeing how close we came to the overturning of the normal electoral process had this enormous effect and that's what made it possible for Biden to get 4 pieces of major legislation that involved trillions of dollars of spending through the Congress. The unity of the Democratic Party, with this extremely narrow majorities in both houses. In the past, those narrow majorities would have fractured and they couldn't get anything through. It was the near-death experience of January 6th that created an understanding in the Democratic Party that they could not go on as they had in the past. They were facing an existential crisis. The only way to handle that crisis was to open the spigots of federal spending, start spending on infrastructure, start spending on clean energy, start spending to overcome the neglect of rural areas. This is an extremely important part of our politics because Trump's victory in 2016 and his strength in 2020 came from the fact that in rural counties across the entire country, red states and blue states, he carried those rural counties with 80% of the vote. That was in many states like Pennsylvania, there are 60 or 70 rural counties. Each one of them is small, but 70 of them add up and made it possible for him to overcome the Democrats' lead in urban and suburban areas. So one of the key aspects of the spending programs that Biden got through was to address the neglect of rural areas that's been part of American politics for 50 years. They don't have broadband, they don't have cell phones, their educational systems are underfunded, healthcare is rotten. They've literally been left behind. Republicans have harvested that resentment with this 80% vote. The Biden strategy is you don't need to win those rural areas, but if you can get the Republican vote down to 65%, 60%, make those areas somewhat competitive, it will shift the electoral map nationally. So I think a part of his, what Peggy is objecting to as the mindless optimism, is essentially trying to forge this new majority of 65, 70% of people who support the big spending, who want the infrastructure, who want clean energy. And it's his way of telling them that the that there's going to be a response to the economic dislocations of the last half century.
Danielle, may I just comment briefly on one point that Fred made? I think Fred's right about January 6th producing more party unity than we otherwise might have had, which made it possible for Biden to pass these enormous programs with a tiny, tiny working majority. But I think there's a backstory here that's very, very important that antedates January 6th. By the time of the transition, that is to say, the period between Election Day and the time that Biden expected to take office, so this is before January 6th, Biden had already been transformed into a much more progressive president-elect than anybody had any reason to believe. And I think there were three reasons for this. One was the COVID crisis and the recession that it created, which just demanded major government action. The other was the fact that neoliberalism had been discredited by events and the political center had moved left. And the most important reason, I think, was the influence of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on Biden. I've often said that what you have is this weird construct of the soul of Elizabeth Warren in the body of Joe Biden, and it sometimes looks like a kind of a mythical beast that doesn't quite compute. But when Biden won big in the Southern primaries, the Super Tuesday primaries, Warren folded her campaign. She became a Biden loyalist, and in return, she had a huge amount of influence, both on Biden's personnel and on Biden's policy. So you have this phenomenon of a very traditional centrist Democrat, because of the moment, because of the pressures on him, deciding to govern like a progressive Democrat. And then on top of it, you have the kind of unity that is forged in the aftermath of the attempted coup on January 6th. So I think both factors help explain why Biden moved the way he did. The tragedy is that he is not the best possible spokesman for his own program. And I think Fred and Peggy both got at this, that if you had a more credible spokesperson who didn't look doddering, he would have popularity ratings in the 60s and 70s, and he'd be the odds-on favorite for re-election. As it is, it's going to be a very close call. The ace in the hole, as it were, is the backlash against all of these crazy Republican policies, beginning with the overthrow of Roe and the attempt by Republican state legislatures to go beyond even that, and the House Republican caucus making a fool of itself. And so depending on how well Biden plays that, we may live to see another day, but it's going to be, as the saying goes, a very close run thing.
But the question is, and certainly when I look at this from the outside, can he play his hand as well as you guys are saying that he can? Because he's got an inimical Congress. Republicans will continue, and certainly they did under Obama. They will do all they can to, and are doing all they can to basically create obstacles for whatever progressive policies that are put forward by the Democrats or the presidency. So how well can, because he said, oh, we have to finish the job during the State of the Union address. How well can he get his people to finish the job, really?
It's all based on his use of executive power. There's going to be no legislation of any consequence.
And the other thing is that the spending authority is there for the programs, so that I mean, the Republicans will try, with the debt limit, with the next budget, to force cuts, but I'm fairly confident that in that showdown, Biden will be able to hold on to the spending programs. I mean, that the Republicans don't really, they'll get outplayed. Shutting down the government is never, or repudiating the U.S. Debt is never a strong card to play.
Peggy, do you share this confidence?
I don't.
Yeah.
But that's an eternal polarity between me and Fred. I'm always the pessimist. The reason I don't focuses on something that's not simply the Republicans, who have enormous power to obstruct, and not simply Biden's own deficits, because he's also very appealing in many ways. What I think may be a serious problem, we already know that these wonderful spending programs that have already passed, as well as the ones he's been really committed to, which are transformative, namely the anti-monopoly and the anti-antitrust program, the remarkable personnel that he brought in the form of Lina Khan and Tim Wu, who's already gone, but Jonathan Cantor, who's head of the antitrust in DOJ, and the Lina Khan move against monopoly is not merely an economic issue. It's fundamentally a pro-democracy issue. All of these, my concern is a structural one, namely that these fall into the category of what some people may be familiar with the term pre-distribution, and as opposed to redistribution. People understand taxes and they understand getting tax cuts, and that enamors people of who's ever giving the tax cuts, or raising taxes obviously does not enamor them. Or open social programs, one way or the other. Those are all take place in the public sphere as redistribution. After people get their pay cuts, their paychecks, then the opponents come along and say, look, they're taking your money and they're turning it into taxes. They're giving it, you're the hardworking Americans. We're giving it all. They're giving it away to the undeserving. Pre-distributive policies take place in the black box of the market that nobody recognizes. And they're more effective in the sense that they will determine just how unequal those paychecks are. So if we can break up the monopolies, that will have an enormously positive impact on inequality, lessen inequality. The problem is that they are invisible to most people. And what we know is that from public polling today is that people think Biden has done nothing. They don't recognize what he's actually done. They think he's had no effect on the economy. And I think a lot of that is the nature of pre-distribution. Its positive aspect is that I think that has a lot to do with why there's been bipartisan support for some of these programs, is that the Republicans are not as afraid of being punished, those who have voted for infrastructure, et cetera, because they're not visible. The negative effect is that he doesn't get credit. They're not recognized. I'll stop there because I think Bob wants to intervene.
Well, let me engage
Quickly, Bob, because I'd like to talk about, the presidency is very important, but I'd like to move on to other things. So quickly.
Well, let me just engage Margaret on the question of whether pre-distribution is necessarily invisible. I mean, in the hands of an effective politician, and Biden is sort of an effective politician on Tuesdays and Thursdays and not effective on Mondays and Wednesdays. But if a $15 minimum wage affects pre-distribution, or if the decision announced yesterday to try to raise taxes on people making over $400,000 a year to keep Medicare solvent, or the policy to tax buybacks I mean, you can bring pre-distribution out of the shadows. You can make it a politically winning issue. Roosevelt was very good at that. But you have to be a very deft politician in polarizing it in a way that benefits regular people and thereby benefits progressive Democrats. And I would give Biden kind of a B on that. He's good some of the time. He misses opportunities other times.
We'll come back
Can
to
I
that
jump in? Can I jump
quickly.
in?
Yeah, quickly, because I'd like to talk about other things. Go
Well,
ahead.
I'm going to segue a little bit towards the Republicans. So I mean, part of my feeling that Biden doesn't have to be that skillful is that one has to understand that the Republican coalition is divided between two very powerful and desperate groups. I mean, one are the donor class, the millionaires and billionaires who are extremely upset that Biden is raising their taxes, that among the other things that the Congress did was that they added $80 billion to the Internal Revenue Service so that the tax system that had become utterly ineffective will have the resources to actually make rich people pay the taxes that they owe, which they haven't been paying for quite some time. So the donor class is desperate because they see that spending is running amok, taxes are going up on them, and so forth. At the same time, the MAGA base, the Trump base that the right created, I mean, it's a sorcerer's apprentice. I mean, that Fox News, the donor class, generated this angry populist MAGA base that Trump then captured and remains loyal to him. That they represent, the roughly, half of the Republican Party, 40-50% of the Republican Party, and is the reason that Trump is likely to get the Republican nomination again if he's not, or even if he is indicted. The problem is that these two desperate groups, the MAGA base and the donor class, have completely conflicting politics. The donor class wants austerity. They want social programs cut. They want Social Security and Medicare cut. The right-wing base wants that spending. They want to protect their Social Security and their Medicare. The problem that the Republican Party faces in presenting an alternative to Biden is that they have a base, they have a coalition that's being torn apart by these conflicting imperatives. And so that is going to make it extremely difficult for whoever opposes Biden to put together a politics that satisfies both of those critical parts of the coalition.
Thank you, Fred, for opening this next segment, really, of our conversation, because this is something I wanted to talk about. It's precisely the Republican Party. We saw with the election of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House a spectacle to a certain extent that was quite surreal, and the fact that a handful of Republicans, fairly ultra-right-wing Republicans, could basically hold the House hostage and impose their conditions for the election of the Speaker is certainly, looking at it from the outside, was quite astonishing. So what's going on with the Republican Party? Is it is the sort of intransigent, authoritarian, ultra-right wing that seems to dominate the party a true reflection of what the party actually stands for? Peggy.
Well, it's important to look at that fight over Kevin McCarthy through clear eyes. It's the way that the press mostly represented it was you had the extremists, the 20 people on the one side, they were the crazy extremists, and then you had the normal Republicans, the rest of the party. Now, who were these normal Republicans? Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jim Jordan, two of the most neo-fascist, outright neo-fascist Republicans that alive today. They were McCarthy's strongest lieutenants. This was not a split over moderate Republicans on one side behind Kevin McCarthy versus a few outliers. The nature of the split is complex and had a lot to do with the politics of how to force rule changes in the speakership, etc. What we know is that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan would have never supported Kevin McCarthy if they hadn't already gotten concessions, extensive concessions out of him towards their right-wing practices, whereas the other ones apparently hadn't gotten enough at the time of the fight. So there simply is no longer such a thing as a, quote, normal Republican Party that's being challenged from the right. Let me just give you an example in Michigan. Michigan had a congressman named Peter Meyer, part of the Meyer dynasty, who was actually voted one of the handful of Republicans who voted to impeach Trump in the second impeachment. So that was gutsy, and there was a handful. Every single one of those so-called moderate normal Republicans either lost the election in the midterms to a right-winger, or they resigned in advance because they knew they were going to lose. Now, Peter Meyer was one of those ones who lost in the primary to a Republican further to the right. And you would have expected, if he were a normal Republican who was committed to maintaining the integrity of the Republican Party, that he would have then stood back and said, well, I can't support my opponent, John Gibbs was his name, because he's an election denier, he's a Trumpist, he's an extreme crazy right-winger. But no, within minutes of losing the primary, he walks over to the Gibbs campaign and says, I'm all in, let's go, John Gibbs. So this is what the nature of the Republican Party is. And this is not a Trumpist phenomenon. This goes back to the civil rights movement, which essentially created an absolute commitment against a full democratization program on the part of the Republicans. There is no longer a moderate party.
Robert, I'd like to hear your take on the Republicans and perhaps also your take on what Fred and Peggy just said.
Two comments. First of all, the Republican Party has been a seemingly unstable coalition since at least Reagan. And the coalition that supposedly cannot cohere is comprised of corporate Republicans who may have moderate social views on things like racial affirmative action or things like religious tolerance. They may be hedge fund guys who do cocaine on the weekends. And yet, they're perfectly happy to get into bed with far-right crazies as long as they get their part of the agenda, which is deregulation and tax cuts and the whole corporate story. So they hold their nose and they get into the same coalition with people who they have no respect for, religious fundamentalists and anti-choice groups and outright racists and so forth. And you would think that coalition would be inherently unstable, but it has been holding together all too well for close to half a century. That's point one. Point two, I would say there are now three wings of the Republican Party. You have the formerly moderate Republicans, mostly in the Northeast. I mean, there were two until this election, there were two traditional moderate Republican governors in Massachusetts and in Maryland. They're gone. And so I would say that percentage of the Republican electorate, maybe 20% on a good day, traditional moderate conservatives who are not haters, a lot of them suburban women, for example. And then the rest of the Republican Party is split two ways. You have the Trumpers who are in favor of Trump and the Trumpers who would like to get somebody other than Trump because they think Trump can't win. And that's somebody like DeSantis. But at least 70 or 80% of the base is now a far right base. And that's why all of these members of Congress who might not be quite so extreme themselves take extreme positions because they're terrified of the base. They're terrified of being contested in primaries by people who are further right than they are. And I think the interesting thing is not whether the traditional corporate, socially moderate Republicans play much of a role, because they're not going to, but whether the DeSantis kind of Republicans, Trumpism without Trump, and Trump destroy each other. And DeSantis is trying to ride crazily right-wing social issues, an attack on wokeism, an attack on public schools, an attack on what's left of affirmative action by making fun of DEI programs, all that stuff. He hopes to ride that denomination. Trump is a very shrewd pseudo-economic populist. So when other Republicans started talking about cutting Social Security, Trump was shrewd enough to understand his base and immediately said, don't you dare cut Social Security, and the Republican Party dropped that. And so I think the question is whether there will be enough division among the Trumpers and the Trumpers who don't want Trump to be the nominee to create enough chaos and divisiveness the Democrats can win, coupled with the fact that, and I'm echoing Fred here, that tactics like holding spending hostage or holding the national debt hostage, that will backfire. A lot of the other crazy stuff that Kevin McCarthy is doing will backfire. The attack on reproductive rights will backfire. And so the question is whether all of that stuff is enough to save Biden, assuming Biden is the nominee, from otherwise being a quite weak nominee.
One thing that doesn't seem to backfire, though, and with the Republicans, and they seem to be pushing that button all the time, is what I would call the culture war issue.
Yeah.
Certainly the critics, after the Republican critics, after the State of the Union address, they sort of forgot about the pocketbook issues and whatever else economic policy issues that Biden might have raised to really push on what I would call the culture war. You talked about wokeism and all that. Do you think that can take them far enough, Peggy?
Well, just one more comment on that, and I'll defer to Peggy.
Yeah.
The contradiction here is what works to win the nomination doesn't necessarily work to win the general election.
Yeah. Peggy?
Well, let me just take issue with the concept of the culture war, because I think that one of the reasons that they're so successful, they seem to be so successful with the culture war, is because it's called a culture war. A culture war is really a conflict of values. It's like saying we don't like Hollywood liberals because they show, gay people and Beyonce wiggling her butt. That's a culture conflict, a culture war. And therefore we should boycott and not go to Hollywood movies. What is going on under the name of a culture war, which the media calls a culture war, is it's criminalizing, in other words, using the violence of the state to prevent people, university professors, kindergarten teachers, and everyone in between from teaching what they want, preventing people by threat of felony imprisonment, absolutely bankrupting fines, using the violence of the state to control human behavior, whether it's under the name of the laws that are going on to destroy women's reproductive freedom, or whether it's education. These are not culture conflicts. These are neo-fascist authoritarian practices. And unless we start naming them, and I'm not saying that we're going to succeed by calling everything fascism. I recognize we've got, this is among friends, and I'm not suggesting we're living in a fascist country. What I am saying is that these are neo-fascist practices, and they add up to a level of social control and political control, and they're also economic issues. Abortion is an economic issue. It takes away women's economic rights, economic liberties, etc. So part of my concern about why DeSantis has been so successful is that we've allowed the media, the framing of this whole thing to be, well, of course I don't want my child to be forced to go to a drag show, as if they're being forced to go to a drag show. We need to reframe what's being called a culture war as a serious infringement, a threat to any kind of freedoms in this country.
But let me jump
you
in.
open that segment. I will let you close that segment on the Republicans. Your take on that.
Okay. So I guess I want to maybe strike a more optimistic note here. In other words, the lesson of the midterms was that the Republicans were seriously punished. They had the worst midterm, basically since Roosevelt, because they had taken such extreme positions on a whole variety of issues, that they put up election denier candidates in Pennsylvania and Arizona. Those people lost. They were repudiated, in some cases quite massively. The most remarkable was Arizona, where the Republicans had put up a slate of 4 election deniers who were way over on the fascism scale, and they all lost in a state that has historically been a Republican state. So a part of what's going on here, I mean, this is why I insist on the Sorcerer's Apprentice, is that the crazy Republican base has gained control over the party, and so that in normal electoral politics, when you're talking about major parties, if a major party has moved too far to the right or too far to the left and has started to lose its electoral support. And remember, the Republicans have only won the actual popular vote for president, once out of this last 7 or 8 times. I mean, it was George W. Bush the second time around. I mean, that both George W. Bush the first time and Trump the first time won, not the popular vote, but because of the Electoral College. So normally the normal thing is that if a party is losing, it moderates its position. It reinvents itself in the way that Tony Blair did with New Labor. The Republicans have been losing, but the extreme base has gotten ever stronger and is able to continue to push candidates to the right. So DeSantis is a wonderful example of this, that up until quite recently, DeSantis resisted putting an extreme abortion ban in Florida because he knows it's unpopular, that the voters don't want it. It's been announced in the last couple of days that some of the legislators are going to put forward a 6-week abortion ban, essentially eliminating abortion in the state of Florida completely. DeSantis has to pretend that that's his his desired outcome in Florida, but it will be then an enormous albatross around his neck if he's running for president as the person who outlawed abortion in the state, because we know from actual election outcomes that outlawing abortion is not popular, that majorities of the electorate, even in white red states, have voted their support for reproductive rights. So again, this is part of the difficulty of that party being able to wage a credible campaign at the national level when winning the primary requires proving your loyalty to an extremist base.
Thank you. In the next segment of our conversation, I would like to perhaps address the bigger picture and engage with each one of you in turn on the basis of some of your recent work. And I would like to start with you, Robert. In your latest book, Going Big, FDR's Legacy, Biden's New Deal and the Struggle to Save Democracy, which was released less than a year ago, you argue that President Biden needs to push even farther than Roosevelt did with his New Deal if the U.S. are to preserve their democracy. You say that the Democrats have to focus more than ever on pocketbook issues and fight big corporations, for example. You also implied that the Democrats, to a certain extent, starting perhaps with Clinton, have in a way lost their way because they accepted the neoliberal mantra of the past 3 or 4 decades. And you seem confident that Joe Biden can turn that tide away. And my question to you is why? Why are you so confident? Because when you think of it, the Republicans of the 1930s were against FDR, but they're certainly not the Republicans of today. Joe Biden certainly doesn't have the aura and the influence that FDR had at the time. And when you look at what Biden is doing, I'm thinking, for example, of his policy on immigration. Certainly immigrant advocates and even Democrats within his own party are quite critical of some of his measures, which basically, for example, he seems to have kept Trump's administration's most decried measure, such as Title 42, for example. So why are you, I'm being the devil's advocate here, but why do you think that Biden can really turn the tide away?
Well, when I wrote that book, it was not at all clear that Biden was going to take my advice. And I was pleasantly surprised that he seemed to take a lot of my advice by governing as more of an economic populist than a lot of people expected him to. So he's good on him for that. Immigration is really, really, really tough. I mean, you can't have a policy of open borders. No country can have a policy of totally open borders. And a lot of the source of this immigration from Central America is earlier waves of U.S. foreign policy that created these horrible economic conditions and horrible regimes. And there's no good solution to it. There are bad solutions to it, and it splits the Democratic Party. So that's a tough one. That has very little to do with economic populism, which is what my book was about. I want to come back to one other thing. I want to say something about wokeism, which DeSantis is trying to ride to the Republican nomination. The left bears some responsibility for this. Not my part of the left, but the part of the left that thinks that slogans like defund the police are smart, or the part of the left that invented the word Latinx that 98% of Hispanic speaking people reject. And, affirmative action was a much more palatable slogan than some of the more far out concepts that parade under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in the lefty academic bubble, it's just fine to be asked for your pronouns, but most ordinary American people are not really cool about having to give their pronouns. So this is really tough because there's no central committee of the left that decides what the tactics are. I mean, these are demands made by people, sometimes in groups who have every reason to be very resentful of how they've been treated, they've been discriminated against, and demand radical reform. But some of this stuff borders on self-parody and really gives people like DeSantis an ability to use this as a cudgel. I don't know what the solution is, but I think we're kidding ourselves if we deny that it's a problem.
We talked about the Republican Party's Atlantic, but the Democrats also have their. I mean, you just alluded to splits, perhaps even divisions within the party.
Yeah.
So, what makes you think that Biden can sort of, bring all the left or the progressives together? Because some of the progressives you're talking about are really much more to the left than Biden himself, way far. So, what do you think? Why do you think Biden will be the guy?
Well, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Biden walks on water. I'm saying he's what we've got. And it's not possible to dethrone a president who's been relatively successful and get somebody else to have the Democratic nomination. Last time we did that was Lyndon Johnson. That was very, very different circumstances. So he's what we've got. And we just have to do the best we can with him.
I wanted to ask Bob a question. I know that before the midterms, that you were very, very hopeful about both Fetterman and Tim Ryan, in particular, seeing that as possibly defeating these two fake, especially J.D. Vance in Ohio, the biggest faux populist imaginable, and Tim Ryan, who is anything but a woke Democrat. He was the sort of essence of economic populism and ran a great campaign. He was destroyed by Vance, seven or 8 points he lost. I'm wondering, and of course, Fetterman, I think, was also just a brilliant campaigner, and we were very lucky in his opposition. He ran against a TV doctor and barely won. Poor guy had a stroke. I'm just wondering, and this is a genuine question, what your thoughts are about Tim Ryan's loss, and because I know we were all optimistic about him winning in Ohio.
Well, let me just put that in context. I mean, in my book, I went out on a limb. I said there are a lot of reasons why the Democrats just might beat the midterm jinx. One is that the Republicans are so crazy and that Trump is going to be in all of his florid craziness on display, even though he's not a candidate. And another is that if you look at the Senate as a whole, the seats that are up, we have more winnable seats that we are defending than they have that they are defending. And even the House is not going to be the kind of blowout that people fear, and we damn near won the House. Now, on the specific case of Ryan, I think Ohio has just become a much more right-wing state for exactly the reasons that you and Fred have talked about, namely that these rural counties that used to support industry have just been hollowed out. And Trump and the Republicans have done a much better job at politicizing that than neoliberal Democrats have. And it's a long, long, long road back. And, Sherrod Brown, who does this better than any progressive, is up next time, and it's going to be a close election. I think Sherrod Brown's a better politician than Tim Ryan. So I think Vance had a tremendous amount of billionaire money supporting him. And I've been on panels with Vance. He's very sly. He's very slippery. He's very clever at disguising himself as some kind of populist, which of course he isn't. So everything broke wrong in Ohio. But what's interesting is that things did break right in a lot of other places in the Midwest. I mean, we have trifectas in Minnesota, and trifectas is the jargon for Democrats having the governor and the House and the Senate. So we have those in Minnesota, we have them in Michigan, we have them in Illinois. And so I think the Democrats are gaining back some places in the Midwest. They're looking better in Wisconsin. And Ohio is just a particularly tough case.
And I want to say that Bob should be given credit as one of the few people who predicted very clearly, I think Fred also did, because Fred is always an optimist, that the midterms were not going to be the wipeout, was not going to be the red wave. And you were predicting that way, way in advance.
But I just want to repeat, I'm not saying Joe Biden walks on water. I'm saying two things. He's better than we had any reason to expect. This is going to be a very tough re-election, and we just have to maximize every opportunity we have.
Yes, thank you. Peggy, I want to turn to you now. In an article that you published, I think last summer in Citizenship Studies, which is titled "De-Democratizing Citizenship, How Neoliberalism Used Market Justice to Move from Welfare Queening to Authoritarianism in 25 Short Years." And you argue, among other things, it's an article I really enjoyed, you argue that there is a de-democratizing project that is being organized by the Republican Party and its donors from above, and by violent right-wing populist movements from below. I have two questions really related. What leads you to such a conclusion? And if we follow you in this argument, does it mean that the path to authoritarianism is irreversible in the United States? And that even with the best of intention, the Democrats will not be able to stem that tide?
No, it's nothing is inevitable whatsoever. What I was trying to do in that article was address, this was a 25-year anniversary of the journal Citizenship Studies, and citizenship studies and the concept of citizenship came to life in the late 80s and 90s in the context of the massive attack from the right on welfare and the welfare state. And that was, of course, what New Labor was about, and that was what Clinton was about. That's what neoliberalism got its kicks from, ending welfare as we know it. And what I was trying to do was to make the argument that to criticize the explanation that so many on the left had at the time, which was that the attack on welfare was about ending the role of the state and returning to the free market. And what I was trying to show was that, first of all, there's never been a free market, and that the attack on welfare was never about returning to an unregulated market. It was about changing who was in control of the political and legal powers that undergird the market, that determine its direction. And that social citizenship, or social welfare in particular, while it's not, it does have very, very important material consequences for people's lives, it's not only about that. It's also a institutional endowment of rights to people. They're not necessarily legal rights, because the courts do not recognize welfare to be a legal right, but it is a sense of rights. It endows people with a sense of being rights-bearing citizens, that they have some right to survive, a right to live. And that social citizenship was very much a driver of democracy. And what I was arguing in this was that the attack on social citizenship was about the right and recapturing those political powers that had made social citizenship possible in order to continue the struggle against too much democracy. And that this, however, went under the radar because it was conveyed in moral terms, attacking so-called welfare queens. And it was framed as a moral violation that normal, hardworking American/white taxpayers were being robbed by undeserving, lazy, and the takers in the culture, i.e. people of color and Black people, welfare queens. And that what that cover did, or that story, that narrative did, was it gave cover to what was really a project to end that sense of rights and entitlements that people had towards welfare. And their success in doing that They were successful in doing that. As we know, welfare was over. What we recognize as the welfare state is pretty feeble right now. And what we're seeing today is a more explicit and open attack on democracy. However, what has started to happen again, and this plays into the comments that we've been having, the discussion about the donor class versus the base, in this standoff over the debt limit is, and once that Biden masterfully took cuts against Social Security and Medicare off the table, what that's done is that's put into the center of discussion where these cuts are going to come from that Republicans are insisting on. And right now, just in today's paper, the New York Times today, the House GOP prepares to slash federal programs in coming budget showdown. They're talking about slashing everything except for Social Security and Medicare by 45%. It's absolutely extraordinary. Now, what's going on here? Part of this is this playing to the donor class now of balancing the budget. Balancing the budget is a complete fiction, of course, because you can't have anything if you have a balanced budget. But it's also about, and here I'll just take a minute to just a quote from Chip Roy, who's a right-wing Republican. We have a $1 trillion, a 32 trillion in debt, which of course we have to solve by slashing budgets. Quote, we've got to get people back to work. In other words, the long-standing argument about fighting welfare is that welfare is a perverse system that gives people permission not to work. And that the only way to drive people back into the workforce is to force them to succumb to market signals, otherwise known as hunger. Only, this is straight out of Polanyi, that only hunger will get people back to work. This is what I argued in that article, and I see it happening again, is that it is a method to the whole attempt to balance the budget, and is to once again to make getting any kind of right to live, to turn it into a moral issue that people are essentially acting as social parasites off of the economy.
Thank you. I apologize. My connection was disconnected for a little while here. I'm back. Fred, I want to go back to you and perhaps conclude on with that. You just released an in-depth article in Politics and Society with two other colleagues. It's a piece in which you revisit an earlier piece in 2008 on the rise of what you call the hidden developmental state in the United States. You argue that the U.S. government has officially rejected industrial policy in favor of extremely, and I quote, extremely sophisticated and decentralized set of innovation policies that work to move new technologies from the laboratory to the commercial space. So you talk about this hidden developmental state. My reaction, and I just want to be the devil's advocate about this, is at the end of the day, if the hidden developmental state still produce the kind of economic progress that Americans want, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with this hidden developmental state? Why should we worry? I mean, of course, it speaks to perhaps transparency and accountability, but if at the end of the day, it produces economic progress, or at least, enhances people's pocketbook, why should we worry?
Well, the issue is, the kind of larger argument is that even the most powerful corporations have become dependent on publicly financed scientists and engineers in U.S. government laboratories or in U.S. government-funded institutes or on campuses to develop their new products, their new processes. I mean, that this runs across the entire economy at this point. And the argument is that my argument is that this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. It's being driven by the dependence on breakthroughs in science and technology, and those people don't particularly want to work in large corporate settings and so forth. The reason it's a problem is because the fruits, the benefits are being appropriated at the top of giant corporations, and there's not a sharing of the gain. So essentially the argument is that the government is taking on the risk of financing the development of these technologies, but the profits, the very considerable profits, are being appropriated by a handful of corporations. And those are the same corporations that have taken advantage of elaborate loopholes in the Internal Revenue Code, and they've diverted their profits to offshore locations like Apple has, and minimize the taxes that they pay. So the consequence is that rather than significant amount of money flowing back into the federal coffers to finance this kind of socialized innovation machinery, that it too is caught in the fiscal crisis of the state. But even more importantly, when the scientific and technological advances are dependent upon large numbers of people on a vast social effort, the idea that Elon Musk should then be worth whatever it is, $200 billion or whatever is utterly absurd. So that's where the problem is, that to make this system sustainable, we need instruments of gain sharing that allow the entire population to share in the benefits, rather than what's happened over the last 40 years. Parts of the country being hollowed out, left behind.
Yep. But you note, I think, towards the end of your article that the Biden administration is in fact extending and deepening the developmental state. So we've been talking about maybe Biden will be not the savior necessarily, but at least this is the best thing we have. So if this is the case, if you are right, then how can we expect any change on that front?
Well, there are a few, signs. Like it came out a week ago that the CHIPS and Science bill put a lot of federal money, like $40 billion, to build chip foundries for microchips for computers in the US, that the government is going to help to fund the building of those factories. The Commerce Department announced that the companies that applied for that money would have to provide quality childcare for the workers who worked in those places. It's a small step, but it's essentially using the resource of federal support to say you've got to raise your level of employment standards. It's a small first step, but it prefigures using the leverage that the government has as being the core of this developmental state to force corporations to improve work conditions, to engage in gain sharing, to create a more inclusive economy. So that's the hope. I mean, a part of my point here is, to kind of connect with what Peggy is saying, that the right has used the mythology of the free market and, to justify this extreme appropriation of profits, by a handful of people, that this is the way the free market works. But in every one of these cases, whether it's Elon Musk or Bezos or any of them, they made their fortunes because the government had made these huge investments in the technology. In the case of Tesla, Musk didn't start Tesla. Tesla was created by another group of engineers who started really the day after General Motors announced that they were giving up on their EV1 electric car, that they had produced under government pressure. And essentially the first hire at Tesla was the guy who had been in charge of the GM effort. So Tesla succeeded by taking advantage of 20 years of development of electric car technology, that had already been funded by the federal government. And they got a huge loan that got them off the ground under Obama.
Thank you. Listen, Fred, I think, and the theory of you, I thank you very much. I think we have about, a little more than 15 minutes left. And I would like to turn to a Q&A session and let some of our members of our public ask questions. There's already, I think, one question. No, that's not it. So if you people who are listening, please raise your hand with the raise hand function that you have on the Zoom, so that and identify yourself. So who's going to go first? If nobody is going first, then I guess, Robert, you
just quickly. To second what Fred said, I think by making the hidden developmental state less hidden, you can extract quid pro quos so that all of the gains are not appropriated by corporations. And that's what the Chips and Science Act does. When the developmental state is hidden and biotech companies take advantage of all of the money they get from the federal government to have supernormal profits, or some of the advances that are invented by DARPA, all go to corporations. The public and ordinary people get nothing back. So by drawing the developmental state out of the closet, making it explicit, you can then have some quid pro quos for everybody else.
Thank you. We have Bill Artsug for a question.
Can I just
Bill?
jump in on that?
Quickly, because we have a question from one of our public. So yeah, quickly, Peggy. Very quick.
The developmental state is part of the process of redistribution, and it makes it look, the hidden nature of it makes it look like the inequality that results from all the gains going to the private sector, despite it being public investment. It makes it look like it's just in the nature of things, that this is not a political decision, but it's just free market forces. That's why it has to be forced out of the shadows.
Thank you, Bill Artsug.
All three of us agree.
We'll go with our public. Bill, can you hear?
Yes. Sorry, I thought my question was just outlined in my chat, but I didn't expect to make a.
Oh, I'm sorry, because you raised your hand.
Okay, that's okay. Here we go.
Send you the link. So you have a question?
Okay, so let's go. Margaret Summers, in referring to Biden's 10 or 15 seconds on democracy in the State of the Union speech, raised the question of how would Biden or other prominent Democrats go about identifying the threats to democracy and alerting people to that, rallying, without saying, getting into the Republican paradigm of it's Santos or it's this or that. I mean, we have prosecutors being threatened with withdrawal of their status. We have legislation trying to name the electors, and a national dialogue is necessary. I think that some Democratic groups on the left, like Justice Democrats, end up not being as rallying as they could be. So it's my question, what would be the message and the approach to really highlight the threats to democracy? Thank you.
Who wants to go on that one?
Well, go ahead. It's really the questions to Margaret.
Yeah. Peggy?
Well, in a way, I'm just repeating a little bit. I think it's by drawing more of an explicit link between the economic populism that he talked about for 70 minutes and the threat to democracy that the economic oligarchy represents, so that, for example, in touting the efforts he's making to fight monopoly, he would make the point, or Democrats would make the point, that monopoly is as much a threat to democracy as it is simply market control and raising prices. That what monopolies do, first of all, and let me say, in addition, not just monopoly, but what's called monopsony, which is a crazy word that simply means control over the labor market. So it's not just so for example, workers today, by and large, have to sign non-compete agreements, and they're subject to arbitration policies instead of have the right to sue. If the Democrats could make the point that these are issues of democracy, you wouldn't have to name names, because it really isn't about George Santos. It isn't about even Ron DeSantos, whatever his name is. In this instant, it's about corporate power. Bob, you take it away.
Well, I think you're raising a strategic question here. Two questions, really. If you want to win by polarizing, you want to define the polarization on terms that bring voters to your side. And there's also the question of what's appropriate for a State of the Union address. So if in a State of the Union address, Biden were to say, the Republicans in this chamber tried to steal the election, and out in the country, Republicans in state houses are trying to steal the next election. And these are the things they're doing to pervert the courts and yada, yada, yada. Number one, does that polarize things in a way that plays to your advantage? And number two, is a State of the Union address, which is supposed to be a unifying theme, is that the right place to do it, or do you do it on the campaign trail? But to go to your point, Peggy, I think the kind of polarization, deliberate polarization, where Democrats can win is to talk about how the big corporations are screwing regular people and how Republicans are the toadies for the big corporations. That gets the message across, and it creates a kind of polarity that plays to the Democrats' strength. So there's a strategic question here. There's a tactical question here.
Fred.
No, I'll pass on this one.
Okay. Other questions from our public?
Yeah, Danielle, it's me. It's Margie.
Margie, go ahead.
Okay, as co-host, I can't seem to get the little hand to go up. I apologize. Bob, I want to come back to you at the very, very beginning when we were talking about the, or you, three of you were addressing the State of the Union address specifically. And Danielle asked you about the various promises that Biden made, and he said, we've got to get the job done, and I will use, I will veto. I mean, he said that numerous times. You then said that he would use this executive power and that we'd see very little legislation. What impact is that going to have on just on to go back to Peggy, on the democracy as it plays out, or as it should play out in U.S. politics? So that's a kind of big question. And then the sort of the question of sound bites and people glued to their televisions is what will that do in Congress? I mean, is this going to be mayhem as he tries to push through all these various promises that he made in his?
Let's start out with executive power. Yeah. So you've got all the great things that the Federal Trade Commission and the antitrust division of the Department of Justice are doing to help regular people, making it possible to buy hearing aids over the counter. That's something that people can understand, save thousands of dollars. Fighting non-compete agreements that force workers to give up whatever little bargaining power they have. Biden devoted a lot of attention in the State of the Union to these hidden nuisance charges, where you get all these added on fees that you weren't expecting. That's something that regular people can relate to. And you can do all of this by executive power. And just to underscore something that Fred said, when the Secretary of Commerce last week announced the terms by which corporations who were putting in proposals to get some of this $52.7 billion under the Chips and Science Act, not only did she require that they provide daycare for their workers, but that there be project labor agreements to make it easier to unionize those jobs. There was also the insulin case, where Biden provides that nobody on Medicare is going to have to pay more than $35 a month for insulin. And 2 weeks later, one of the biggest corporations that makes astronomical markups by selling insulin agrees that, okay, we too are going to cap costs at $35. So these are things that don't take legislation, and that regular people can understand as ways that the Democratic administration is helping them out.
Let me just throw in that the reference in the State of the Union to finish the job was a reference to the re-election campaign and the probability that if Biden's reelected, the Democrats would gain control of both houses and would then be able to push through more legislation. So, that was what finish the job meant. He knew perfectly well that nothing was going to get through, or very little was going to get through in the next 2 years.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, Peggy?
I want to ask a question to my fellow panelists, if I may.
Go ahead.
It's the possible, what we could call as Biden's weaknesses or his possible even failures. Just yesterday, a woman named Gigi Son, who is a fabulous public interest advocate and former FCC official, after 16 months, she was nominated 16 months ago and has been just pummeled by the right who've gone after her. She withdrew her nomination to be on the FCC, which leaves the FCC deadlocked. The other thing that's one failure or disappointment. The other thing is that we now know, apparently it's not final yet, that Biden may nominate a woman named Janice Eberly, who was the former deputy to Tim Geithner, I believe. Is that not correct? Oh, she was, yeah.
I'm shaking my head at how awful it is.
How awful. And Geithner literally masterminded the program by which they bailed out the banks and did not bail out homeowners and forced the largest foreclosure movement. So my question is, what I'm worried about in the forthcoming election is that is the Fed, and that they're going to relentlessly keep raising interest, and that we really will go into a recession, and they'll have the help of Janice Eberly right at the time of the election. Is this just my usual pessimism? What do you think?
And this goes to my Biden doesn't walk on water point. I mean, he's dropped the ball on a few important nominations, and these are two of them. I mean, he let Sohn just dangle for months and months and months, and the nomination was finally done in by 3 corporate Democrats who decided, led by Joe Manchin, who said they could not support her. And this, by letting her just twist in the wind, that gave big tech, big telecom months and months and months to just demonize her. She's also a lesbian, and that stimulated a hate campaign. And his stuff on the Fed has been terrible. And this is not him. I mean, you wonder who among the senior staff is making these calls. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is under the illusion that she runs the Fed as well as the Treasury. And I'm guessing that her fingerprints are all over this one. and she's quite orthodox on monetary policy and on trade policy. So just because Biden turned out to be a little more populist than we thought, it doesn't mean there's not an undertow of all of this neoliberal corporate Democrat stuff around him.
Fred?
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. And, you know, that Bob's point here is that these conservo Dems in the Senate are, you know, up to their old tricks of interfering and making trouble. So, but kind of on the larger issue, I think that the basic idea is that if the Fed keeps tightening, there could be a recession, but that it would be brief, and it would be in the second half of this year, and that the election year would be a year of recovery, and that the amount of federal spending would make it possible for the economy to bounce back fairly strongly.
The only thing that's wrong with that is that Powell has become fixated on this idea that we have to get the inflation rate down to 2%. And all of the economic projections say that that's not possible ever without a deep recession. And so the soonest, the Fed's own economists are saying that even with stringent rate increases, the soonest you could get back down to 2% is 2026. And so Powell, the chair of the Fed, is sacrificing the real economy on this number that's an arbitrary number. For most of the boom years, the inflation rate was 3 or 4%, and we did just fine. So this is just crazy conservative economics. The question, again, the tactical question is whether Biden should go out front and attack the Fed. That's kind of a tough call. But at least if he appointed decent people to the Fed, they could be a counterweight to Powell.
Dear colleagues, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you very much. Before we leave, though, I do have one question, a very quick question that can be answered in 2 seconds. Who are going to be the presidential candidates in 2024? Bob?
Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Okay. Fred?
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say Biden and DeSantis.
And Peggy?
I would say Joe Biden and either Donald Trump or DeSantis.
Yeah.
Good for you, Peg.
Margie, back to you for the closing.
Okay, I have no closing remark other than to say thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, this is so interesting. I wish we had more time. Thank you for your generosity in accepting to engage with us again across the border, where we have our own issues, but they're not nearly as interesting, stimulating, exciting, disturbing. We're worrying about Chinese balloons and people tampering with our elections, which is actually very serious.
Well, thanks to Canada for modeling what a more normal country looks like.
Well, we don't know what normal means anymore, do we? I guess we have to redefine normal. But so my thanks to you. Should tell you that you'll be called upon for take 3. So be ready, please.